I once told my mother that I'd never met anyone that I felt was remotely similar to me.
He did say to me once that he feels like people are talking a different language to him.
Luke says that at school, to him, it's like being a foreigner.
When I was at primary school, it did upset me quite a lot that I didn't seem to be able to make very many friends.
He does occasionally have an odd little interaction with another child, but the majority of the time he plays on his own.
These people all have one thing in common. They have Asperger's syndrome, a condition at the more able end of the autistic spectrum.
So we've been talking about extreme habitats.
For a child with Asperger's syndrome, the classroom experience can be very different to that of other children.
Can anybody remember the name of a plant or an animal that lives in the polar regions? Chloe?
In this programme, we'll be identifying some of the features which are seen in an extreme form in Asperger's syndrome.
The temperature can get up to 48 degrees Celsius, so it's really, really hot. And it's really dry as well. They have less than 10 centimetres of rainfall every year. So let's have a look at Tom's painting. Here's the desert. You can see the sun beating down. It looks really hot. There's sand everywhere. But there are a few plants and animals on here that are adapted to live in the desert. John, can you think of any plants or animals that live in the desert? John, did you hear me? What animals might live in the desert? John? John, you've not been concentrating all day. Now, will you pull your socks up and pay attention?
A lot of children who have Asperger's syndrome struggle in school. They struggle with their understanding. They have a very literal understanding of language. They struggle with their social interactions. And quite often the school environment now makes it quite difficult for them to learn. And so we need to be able to identify them so we can support them appropriately and help with their education and their psychological development and progress.
Approximately 9 out of 10 people with Asperger's syndrome are male. We're going to meet several people with Asperger's syndrome. First of all, Joe.
Well, this here is called Triceratops. It's got 3 horns, 1 small near the beak and 2 on the frill. The frill is big and like a semicircle.
Typically for a child with Asperger's syndrome, he has an intense special interest. Joe's is dinosaurs.
This is called Iguanodon. It lived 144 to 135 million years ago.
He has a hugely scientific mind. He likes classification and he likes things to be in the right place and in the right order. So anything like dinosaur, where there is a lot of classification into different periods of time and into different groups of dinosaurs. He likes that.
And very big toes.
What Joe doesn't like, another very typical feature of Asperger's syndrome, is interacting with his peers.
Now it's your turn.
This makes functioning in a class of 30 children extremely difficult.
I need to match flies or spiders. I need to match spiders.
At the moment, Joe doesn't come to assembly with us in the morning. He finds it just too much to come into a hall with such a large number of children. So it works out quite well. Our assembly's first thing in the morning, and that's the time when Joe has just his quiet time with his learning support assistant. Without her, he really couldn't manage in school.
It's a good game, isn't it?
Joe has his own separate workstation in the classroom.
It has a screen around it to cover up some of the distractions of the other children. Sometimes if he's feeling cross or worried or anxious about something, he'll go back. It's like a security thing for him, really. And he tends to sort of know himself when he needs to go and have a bit of time on his own.
Although he has his own workstation, he has a place at another table with a group of 9 children, and more now he will actually voluntarily go to work at the table with the other group of children.
He is very, very unhappy.
And look, he's covered in straw.
That's the biggest challenge for Joe, is interacting with other children. I do worry about that a lot because he is socially isolated, and not from lack of opportunities. Children approach Joe. I think his classmates have been fantastic.
Yeah, I've got an at the end of my name.
He finds it extremely difficult to interrelate with other children, and often if he wants to talk to another child, he'll ask me to make the remark to the child, or please can you ask her for the rubber, or whatever it is, whatever small thing that he wants.
Children like Joe with Asperger's syndrome often stand out in the playground because they don't join in with the other children.
We're staying on the small playground today because the big children are on the big playground.
To add to Joe's problems today, there's a change of plan at playtime. Children with Asperger's syndrome typically find any unexpected change in routine very upsetting.
He lacks flexibility to a really large degree. It makes him very anxious if things aren't the way he thinks they should be.
Joe does find the playground quite difficult. If he becomes anxious, he tends to flap his arms. It's been one of his targets to build up so that he actually goes out to playtime for 5 minutes, and he's now actually spending the whole of playtime outside. He doesn't really interact with the other children. He tends to make up his own little game. He finds the noise very difficult, and at times he will spend a large part of the playtime with his hands over his ears.
Yeah, they've gone now. We can go and line up.
I'm hoping that Joe will find things easier as he gets older and learns more about how school works. Obviously, my big hope is that he'll make a friend, at least one friend, and that would be a wonderful thing to happen.
Many children with Asperger's syndrome do learn to cope better as they get older. Charlie's difficulties have become less severe in the past couple of years.
Asperger's syndrome, it is something that makes me different from other people in some ways, and it's why I sometimes might be a little moody sometimes. Can I go inside?
In a minute. He was diagnosed when he was, I think, about 6.5, but before then, when he was 3, I was concerned because he wasn't really talking and he wouldn't play with other children, he wouldn't sleep. I was constantly asked to leave places, mums and tots and playgroup and nursery, and wherever we went there was always a situation where he'd hurt somebody or he'd upset somebody or he'd behaved inappropriately.
Like Joe, Charlie has obsessive interests. One of his latest is collecting stones.
I have an extremely vast collection, ranging from very common stones to semi-precious to precious stones, some that are rarer than diamonds, I have in my possession. This here used to be a wand of quartz, which is what you'd call a stick, which looks a bit like a pentagon. This part here was a pentagon. It was left to grow and grow, and it's grown out, and so in there, this wand of quartz goes through there, but it's grown out into a formation of quartz.
He's completely controlled by whatever his obsession is, as far as spending money and places he wants to go and the material he's prepared to read. So it's very restricting and very controlling, not just for him but for everybody around.
Charlie, just going to sit down if you've had a drink, please.
After a problematic start at school, he manages without extra support. But there are still some difficulties.
Well, I have sat Charlie by himself recently after we've done the SATs exams. I've left the desks as they are and he's been sitting on his own because Charlie does sometimes irritate whoever he sits next to, or he distracts them. He used to have problems with calling out a lot, and he still does that, but much less so than he used to. And sometimes when he answers a question, he goes on and on and on. So instead of just giving a line answer or a one-word answer that I'm looking for, and the other children realise I'm looking for, he'll explain it in absolutely massive scientific detail or something.
To move on to the next level, answer this problem, there are, at the moment we have 420 children. We need enough piggles.
Good. I think link it to CGL, yeah? You have to kind of cut him short because you're trying to move the lesson forward. Charlie's main difficulties are probably socially, to be honest, and when he's in the playground and things like that. And though there isn't really a problem when he's in the playground, he worries that there's going to be, and he feels a bit excluded, and he's been known to say that he feels that he hasn't got his own sort of special group of friends.
I think when he tries to interact with children, he likes to do it on his terms. It's the social skills, and it's also the unsaid words. There are just a lot of things that you don't realise that you don't actually say, mannerisms, facial expressions, and Charlie finds that quite difficult.
One of Charlie's other problems is that when we do things that are different to normal and we upset his routine, then he gets worried. And all the bad aspects of his behaviour do tend to come out. So he might rock more, he might lose his concentration more, he might put his head down on the desk more. What do we do? Think about
I don't mind changes too much, but I just don't really like them. I mean, sometimes they're okay, but if we're going to do maths and we end up doing literacy, then I find it difficult to concentrate.
It's not an English word, so you wouldn't know how to spell it.
I think the school that he's at the moment have coped really well because it's not just his problem, it's the class problem, and it's a problem for the teacher.
Well done. Tia's found my spelling mistake.
And they've done really well to get him to conform and to do all the social things that are expected of him. I've got a year till Charlie transfers to secondary school, but I'm already concerned about it. I can't imagine the journey to school on a bus, changing from place to place, reading a timetable, not being picked on. I can't imagine any of it happening without a huge amount of distress for Charlie and obviously for me, so it's in my mind all the time, really.
After the more nurturing environment of primary school, children with Asperger syndrome like Luke can find many aspects of secondary school a challenge.
I'm getting a new organiser. It's well worth one. Colour Scion Revo.
Luke's been to 2 secondary schools. The first one, after he came out of primary school, he went to a state secondary school. And basically he was bullied, to such an extent that it just wasn't workable. Eventually he was physically chased out of school. He was battered in the street. So I just removed him from that day.
I think this school is better than my last school because you're sort of left to your own devices, because you get to go in the IT room, go in the library, and you don't have to interact with everybody else. I guess people have difficulties with small talk. That's generally what teenagers do. They just talk about the weather or what music they've been listening to lately, and I just find it hard to cope with.
Luke's never actually had any friends. And over the years, he's always been on his own, being quite happy. He says that he's quite happy on his own, and he certainly seems it.
Part of the problem with social interaction for people with Asperger's syndrome is that they have difficulty reading facial expressions.
It's really hard to find the subtle differences between expressions, and a lot of people seem to get this naturally. But with AS people, it's a lot harder and you have to learn from memory. And as people's faces change all the time and people's appearances change, it's really hard to learn everybody's face separately.
No, right? I'd say older, like 60. Yeah, could have made him Tony Blair, couldn't I?
Added to this is the fact that some children with Asperger's syndrome find eye contact difficult.
When I first met Luke, I knew that I had a pupil in my class who suffered with Asperger's syndrome. I realised that eye contact was one of the primary points, and to be honest, as soon as I met Luke, I knew he was the one with Asperger's syndrome. Sometimes it can be disconcerting, the fact that he doesn't make eye contact with you, especially when you're trying to give him instructions.
When I'm looking at somebody talking to me, usually I actually get uncomfortable by like their eyes and just like the feeling of them boring into me.
The satirical characters in Macbeth.
I usually look at the mouth then. That's one of the best tricks that I've found out so far. Although it does give you a sort of dazed look.
Think about some of the writers that perhaps you enjoy reading. If you don't read, then now is the time to start. Luke can sometimes be disorganised, particularly when it comes to homework. Trying to get him to write things down when you ask him to is sometimes a very difficult task, so I have to stand over him when it comes to homework. I have to say to him, you need to note this down, Luke. You're not going anywhere. Can you write it down in your diary so you don't forget? Get your diaries out, please. Just write for me. Choose an author. Yeah.
Usually I get distracted by the bell as it like rings really loud, like right in your ear. I don't hear like anything the teacher is saying. A lot of the time I miss the homework completely and I come home thinking I've got no homework whatsoever. And then I look in someone else's homework diary and find out that they've got like 4 pieces of homework and I haven't a clue that they were even there.
You may go, off you go.
Luke's next challenge is to get to his history class.
I've always had difficulty since primary school finding my way from one class to the next because you're like moving like every 40 minutes. I get a lot of people being annoyed at me for following them.
One thing Luke hasn't learnt to cope with at school is sports lessons.
People with AS have problems with noise, social interaction, teamwork, everybody running around like complete chaos. And with games and PE mixing all of these together, then it just makes both of them complete hell.
The school now allows him to miss sports lessons. It's also timetabled special needs classes for Luke. Today they're working on language.
We're going to leave that for the moment and look at idioms that you were working on last week.
Take what she says with a pinch of salt.
People with Asperger's syndrome don't readily understand idioms and metaphors. Language needs to be very clear and concise.
AS people always understand things very literally because, say, if someone says, for example, I'll give you another bite of the cherry, then they wouldn't know that that means they'll give them another chance. So, for example, a cherry is too small to have more than one bite anyway, so.
The school also allows Luke to go to the IT room at lunchtime rather than having to socialise with the other children.
I don't know really why, but computers seem to be like easier to deal with, so I just like go on them at lunchtime and it's a lot easier than like mingling with all the kids.
Luke and a lot of children with Asperger's syndrome try really, really hard to fit in at school, and they actually come across very well and manage very well to do this, but it takes so much out of them that literally the second they come through the door, they blow a fuse. Luke is very, very moody. I just have to let him go onto the computer and just slowly process the events of the day.
computers are definitely Luke's obsession.
After school, I usually spend around 7-8 hours on the computer. The only drawback is that it annoys my mum and my family so much that it just like drives them mad.
He doesn't speak about anything else, he doesn't think about anything else at all at home, and an obsession is something that takes over your life, and it definitely does with Luke.
Thank you, Joe.
You would think that because Luke's a member of a big family that he's got perfect opportunity for lots of social interaction and socialising, but in reality it doesn't happen that way. He's still isolated at home. At meal times, if I manage to get him off the computer, then he just sits on his own, sits quiet, eats his meals, looks at everybody as if they're from another planet, and ping, the elastic pulls him back to the computer again.
Among people with Asperger's syndrome, there's a wide variation in the difficulties they experience. So how is it diagnosed? Today, Dr. Fiona Scott is diagnosing a 9-year-old boy.
A diagnosis typically takes about a day, and it involves a 2 to 3 hour developmental history interview with the parent, an hour one-to-one observation with the child, typically in their home, and then a morning or an afternoon observing the child in school with their peer group and in the classroom. Right now I'm heading to see a family in their home to do an observation and an interview with the parent. Would Stephen ever talk with you just to participate in a social chat or small talk?
No, I find it very difficult having a conversation with Stephen. I always had to start a conversation, and then, unless it was about his interest, such as Pokemon or Lego at the time, you couldn't just have a normal chit-chat conversation. It's certainly not the same as his friends.
Has Stephen ever seemed oversensitive to noise at all?
Stephen dislikes the noise of the vacuum cleaner, food mixer. He doesn't like loud sounds. He's easily, in class, he's easily distracted by noises such as a dog barking outside. At parties, he will cover his ears up to an entertainer or to loud music.
We try to make the diagnoses as objective as possible, but it gets very difficult, and most people that you talk to would say ultimately it's down to clinical experience, because there's no easy test for Asperger syndrome. So you have to piece together all the information you get from the school observation and the parent interview and observing the child, and build up the jigsaw and see if that fits what your understanding and experience of Asperger syndrome is. What do you like doing here?
Playing.
What do you play at?
Play in the garden sometimes.
What kind of things do you do?
I don't know.
What you see with Stephen, which is typical to Asperger syndrome, is difficulties with eye contact, particularly with people he doesn't know very well. He has problems with pretend play. Which one do you want to be? Which one are you going to play with? How about if you'd be the wrestler?
No.
No? What about the lady?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. He finds it difficult to talk about his feelings and to describe emotions and feelings clearly. And he uses quite unusual language when he tries to explain what happy is, for example. What does a happy face look like?
Lips up.
Lips are up.
Others. Others.
What's your best friend called?
Andrew.
Ah, and does he go to the same school as you?
Used to, but then I moved.
Oh. What's different about someone who's a friend and someone that you just go to school with?
I don't really know.
Ah. Do you think all of the children in your class are friends?
Definitely not.
No. What makes some of them not friends?
Keep getting into fights.
Oh dear. He has problems as well understanding friendships and being able to very clearly say what a friend is and how that's different to someone that he just knows.
Stephen does receive a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome.
Recent research has really suggested that there are about 1 in 200 people who have Asperger syndrome, which is much higher than we used to think, and it's a substantial number of children and adults who need support within our community.
Peter is a 22-year-old with Asperger's syndrome. His special passion is juggling.
I'm very interested in juggling at the moment. I have been for about 4 or 5 years now. I spend a long time every day practicing, and up to 4 or 5 hours a day, depending on how much time I have available. Well, there are some mathematical aspects to juggling. You can juggle patterns with different throw heights, which mathematically is described in terms of the timing in which you throw. And I have some examples of some calculations I have done here to find new patterns with different throw heights.
Both Peter and his twin brother Matthew have Asperger's syndrome. But unlike Joe, Charlie and Luke, the twins went through school without a diagnosis.
My time at school was quite difficult at some stages. In primary school, it was a lot more difficult because children are a lot more crueler at that age, obviously, and I got bullied quite a lot. I did feel from quite a young age that I was very different from the other children in some undefinable, indescribable way. The teachers tried to treat me very assertively. You know, they would often shout at me or send me out of the room. You know, if they felt that I wasn't contributing, or they felt because I looked very unemotional that I was being cold. I think that some of the teachers thought I was trying to make their life difficult. I think they thought I was being stubborn or misunderstanding them on purpose, and a few of them were a little adversarial. I think if the teachers had been aware that I'd had a diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, they might have been a little more patient with me, treated me a little bit more gently, and explained things just that bit more carefully.
Despite their problems at school, Matthew and Peter did very well academically and have recently graduated from university.
A lot of these children are very, very good in a lot of areas, such as computer programming, in mathematical understanding and physics. So it's not necessarily the case that having Asperger's syndrome is a detriment to a child, as long as the support is appropriate to help them.
I think Joe's generation is really lucky to have had early diagnosis, and it means that whatever difficulties we have at school, hopefully he won't feel guilty, feel like he's failing, have all those difficulties, which I'm sure would lead to depression later on.
When I was first diagnosed with AS, I mostly think I felt relieved because all through my life I've been called, well, I could write a list for you if you want. I've been called a freak, a geek, and a nerd, and any other name you can think of, but including a few which I'm not going to mention here. And it was just good to know that I wasn't like any of these, and it was just, there was actually a name for it, and it wasn't all just me.